Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about Ukraine and whether it's about to be bankrupt or not. So stick around for that. But first, another data point that is 70%. That is the current likelihood, according to betting markets, that Donald Trump, will win the U.S. presidential election this November.
Day two, the Republican National Convention, and right now, all eyes are on Milwaukee as the GOP rallies around former President Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, just days after the assassination attempt.
If you weren't already following the presidential election, the past few days may have changed all of that, but paying attention is one thing, and enjoying it.
4 months away from the election, some political experts think the shooting in Pennsylvania will be a major factor.
And President Biden is already pulling his ads for tomorrow, and this will likely sway some voters.
Trump's own high estimation of his chances of victory seemed to be reflected in his choice of vice president, which was revealed this past week at the Republican convention in Milwaukee. That choice was Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, who is someone who styles himself in the same vein of conservative populism that Trump himself has come to symbolize. And that seems to mark a shift in the party's relationship with business, at least in theory. And that's why we wanted to take a closer look right now at what exactly the relationship is between today's GOP and big business. So, Adam, this new conservative populism is sometimes described as a repudiation of the traditional Reaganite Republican coalition that's been around for several decades, that being a coalition between big business, social conservatives, and also nationalist conservatives associated with the military. In the populist configuration, business seems to be sacrificed to the interests of the others somewhat. But at the same time, Vance was a venture capitalist before he was a senator, and he's also very close to Silicon Valley conservatives, including Peter Thiel. So is there a contradiction between populism and big business at all? Or is this really more an indication of the rise of a new type of business elite that represents different industries in this new conservative coalition?
It's a really fascinating situation that we're in and hard to read. And I think the simplest and smartest answer to all of these questions will be it's too soon to tell and we shall see what happens. But you could just be cynical and say, J.D. Vance is a man on the make. He will say or do anything necessary to advance his career. I think there's an element of that in play. He's clearly incredibly ambitious. Another more sympathetic reading would be that he's also traveling an astonishingly long way. I mean, of course, he's stylized this for everyone to read in the form of this memoir/account of Appalachian or sub-Appalachian Ohio industrial culture, hillbilly elegy. But he is a man who has traveled remarkable distance in terms of his political career. In some senses, therefore, the contradictions may be the unfolding, I think, of the sort of tensions of a Bildungsroman, the formation of a rather remarkable American biography. So you start in one place, you end up somewhere else, and people say you're contradicting yourself as you go along. I mean, what he was a venture capitalist, and specifically in the sort of orbit of Peter Thiel, who was a early PayPal investor along with Elon Musk and people like that, and is now big in Palantir, which is the security wing, if you like, national security wing of the Silicon Valley scene, so much less liberal, more conservative, more hawkish in international politics. And I think it's important here basically to differentiate. And the way that we're going to escape a notion of contradiction thinking about this is by just thinking hard about what kind of capital this is. So this is a venture capital. This is not private equity. This is not corporate raiding. You're not going into existing businesses and tearing them up and firing people and trying to, skim profits. You're actually trying to generate new business. So this is a protean, imaginative way of thinking about how capitalism is going going to transform the world. So their businesses are all named after characters and items from Tolkien and, the world of fantasy, if you like. They talk about, space exploration. So it's that kind of dimension of American business for starters. It's not a zero-sum class war kind of conception. I think that's the one key element of this story. And it's also middle tier, right? So the Trump coalition is made up above all of idiosyncratic venture private equity, which can run into the billions, but is not trillion-dollar balance sheets of the mega corporate world. And all the way down from there to blue-collar folks in trailers by way of extremely prosperous, what are called the American gentry, car dealership owners, the owners of dry cleaning chains, kind of what we would once upon a time in class terms have called petty capitalist or petty bourgeois. And in that kind of view, there are lots of ways of squaring this circle, right? So you can basically be against big tech whilst being in favor of little tech. So Vance is, by all accounts, a public fan of Lina Khan, who is one of the more aggressive. We were talking about her when we talked about Kamala Harris last time, like one of the more aggressive exponents of antitrust, because somebody like Vance sees the big tech platforms as A, liberal, so not aligned with Trump, B, censoring of his sort of politics because they consider it beyond the pale, and C, dominating the market, which is bad for smaller businesses coming up and also bad for workers. So there's quite a lot of work by folks like Lina Khan which show that the monopsony position, so the monopoly buying position of a player like Amazon, actually lowers wages wherever Amazon builds a warehouse because they exercise so much market power and set effectively a minimum wage, which is defined by the Amazon wage. And so you can see how you can combine all of these elements into something which is actually not so contradictory, but a relatively coherent vision of a kind of nationalist reconciliation between the interests of the quote-unquote little people, which range from the workers to up-and-coming new businesses that want to change the world in a positive way and stand opposed by incumbent oligarchic liberal establishment interests. And Vance stands for the former group against the latter.
Got it. But if we were to, try to take a look at how this relationship with business squares with the Republicans' current policy priorities, I'm curious what we would say. I mean, who benefits, for example, from crackdowns on immigration? I mean, is big business really the beneficiary of that? Or, one of the things that the ticket, both Vance and Trump seem to be in favor of, is a less independent monetary policy and specifically a weaker U.S. dollar. Again, I'm curious if, these businesses that you're describing are aligned with this new coalition, if they benefit from that as well. Or should we sort of conclude that, to the extent these policy ideas oppose those business interests, should we just expect them to be less of a priority at all for a renewed Trump administration, as opposed to just, say, tax cuts that businesses will always benefit from?
Yeah, this is where we really are going to have to see how this plays out, because it's all very well to talk about, the need to promote small businesses and workers' interests against the coalition of incumbents. But when Trump was in office the last time round, his appointments at the senior economic policy level, as opposed to regulation and so on, were straight down the middle, relatively conservative representatives of established interests. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens this time. So, yes, on the face of it, the proposal to engage in mass deportations, there are, by estimates of, say, the Pew Research Center, over 7.5 million, probably now, given the huge surge in immigration, over 8 million undocumented, unauthorized migrants in the United States who are in the workforce. There's probably closer to 10 to 11 million actually living in the US, but they're disproportionately active in the labor force, far from being parasitic on the welfare system. They're actually huge contributors to the American workforce. And at the bottom end of the American labor market, it's very hard to see how employers would do without them. And it's not obvious that there are 7 or 8 million Americans eager to do the kind of jobs for the kind of pay that those people do currently, which is menial cleaning, service, construction work on the whole. And so, estimates by the Peterson Institute suggest a 5% shock to American GDP, because that's roughly speaking what 7 to 8 million workers would be as a share of the American workforce. that's a huge and damaging impact, which you would expect to rally a massive coalition against any such policy, setting aside the humanitarian, the legal, the political aspects of any kind of mass deportation program. Because where on earth are these people going to go? To Mexico? Surely not. That's not reasonable. A fraction of them are Mexican, but only a fraction. The same goes for the tariff policy. Many of the tariff proposals that the Trumpians are making are not just in violation of WTO, but much more significantly, they're in violation of the trade arrangement with Mexico and Canada, which used to be called NAFTA, and which is overwhelmingly America's most important trade relation, which isn't with China, but with Mexico and Canada, which are part of an integrated production system with the US. And if the Republicans went about trying to challenge this, demolish this, raise tariffs all around, they would face retaliation from their leading trade partners, which will be Mexico and Canada, which would really hurt. And the last time Trump tried to do this, the agrarian lobby, the farm lobby mobilized, and Trump realized that farmers love him famously. This was one of his phrases when he was shown the impact on the farm sector. Oh, I better not do that. And so NAFTA survived. It was renegotiated as the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement in its current form. And I would expect a similar kind of struggle to go on if they actually attempt to make good on these really dramatic interventions in the structure of the US economy, because it is notionally possible that domestic producers would benefit from a tariff, or that workers locally would benefit from an even tighter labor market. But it presumes in both cases that there are either American businesses or industrial capacity or workers who actually want to fill those slots, rather than actually regarding the American trade imbalance and the flow of migrants as a highly functional arrangement which raises the standard of living for most Americans. And if they go forward with, for instance, the suggestion which has been widely touted of Jamie Dimon moving from retirement, out of his glide path out of JP Morgan into the US Treasury slot, then they'll be dealing with somebody who, will offer not so much deep state as just straight in the cabinet resistance to any measures along these kind of lines, I would say. So though those two platforms are rather important in Republican rhetoric right now, and if you watch the Republican convention, you see people waving these highly aggressive banners about mass deportation and telling people to pack their bags and so on, there will no doubt be an increase in brutality, if you like, a draconian new system. But from the point of view of economic policy, it's very hard to see how this could be sustained as anything more than really a disaster. It will be very bad in the short run for the functioning of US economy, US society, many communities. It will almost certainly be inflationary, which is one of the big issues over which the Republicans have been hammering the Democrats. It's not, you can't rule out the possibility that they try to do it. Disasters do happen. And apparently Trump is in a more radical mood than he was the first time round, and his team are better prepared. But, it will be really a shock if it happens. It will be, a true natural experiment in policy dysfunction.
I suppose the same inflationary point would also go for weakening the US dollar if they also pursued that as well.
Yeah, this is the most outlandish of the proposals, is to move on the US dollar. And it's to conflate the question of the dollar's strength with the reserve status of the dollar. I mean, the dollar functions as a global reserve in large part because most of the time it's actually quite weak and widely abundantly available. The idea that dollar strength goes hand in hand with reserve status is a complete fallacy. How exactly they would move to disrupt the value of the dollar is not at all obvious, and the steps that might be necessary are so dramatic that I think if that line of argument is pushed further, you and I should return to this theme, because it's so dramatic and consequential in its implications, and the economics are a little bit tricky actually to understand how exactly that would work.
Yeah, gladly. Okay, because I would have assumed that interest rates are sufficient in some ways, but we can return to that point at some point. But I actually also wanted to shift to the question of foreign policy and how the Republicans' policy platform is changing there. It seems like they're, to use terms that I believe Walter Russell Mead, the foreign policy analyst, defined, it seems like there's a shift to a more Jacksonian posture, basically a kind of defensive nationalist posture under Trump and Vance, as opposed to the traditional Republican Hamiltonian posture of sort of maintaining global ties to kind of benefit U.S. economic interests, global economic interests. And obviously, there's also a strain of Republican traditional foreign policy that's Wilsonian, basically seeking to spread U.S. values around the world. That was very evident in the George W. Bush administration. But yeah, again, there's a shift away from all that towards this more defensive Jacksonian posture, at least. I'm curious, like, what, from a business perspective, what businesses in the U.S. benefit from that more isolationist, more restrained, ostensibly less globalized, less interventionist U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, it's for those of our listeners who aren't steeped in America's political history, and it's one of the peculiarities of American political discourse that it routinely refers to 18th and early 19th century figures as key reference points, even in the 21st century. So Andrew, the Jacksonian we're referring to is Andrew Jackson, who came into power as president in 1828, yes, really the early 19th century, and is widely known in current discourse as a great Indian killer. So he was one of the sort of advocates of westward expansion and the genocidal destruction of indigenous populations. He is also, however, a inspiration for, as you're saying, Cam, a posture which is a sort of, maybe it's just a sort of national interest first, but national interest defined in rather parochial local terms. So it's skeptical of big business, hates the establishment, demands common sense solutions to complex problems. So a kind of early 19th century populism, which distinguishes it from, more highbrow versions of American politics. I think it's really quite difficult to tell how this works out from an economic point of view, because the Biden program is hardly directly aligned with the interests of globalized American business. Rather the contrary, right? The American business would, I think, much prefer to just continue with, well, what it would really love is the 1990s regime, late 20th century regime of the so-called rules-based order, right? Which would be a system in which there would be relatively stable international legal norms for commerce, in which private business would be respected in its autonomy, in which they could pursue their investment and trade patterns as they liked, with the United States using its unipolar power to enforce those rules on the premise that this would be particularly good for American business, right? So that's the kind of, those are the halcyon days of the 90s, and even the Obama administration had elements of this. What has changed, of course, is that the competitive environment has become much rougher, and the geopolitics has escalated, and it's not at all clear, I think, if they have to choose between a continuation of the Biden regime, which only this week has announced the further ratcheting up of increasingly punitive sanctions, not just on China, but on countries like Japan and the Netherlands that want to go on in continuing high-tech trade with China. That's the Biden counterfactual, right? The escalating economic warfare logic. It's not obvious to me whether they would prefer that or take a chance on the incoherence of the Trump program, which on the one hand has extremely hawkish, like Peter Navarro types in it, who essentially, or Steve Bannon, who eventually imagine, I think, a military conflict with China, or the president himself, who basically says, she used to be my friend. I wish we could go back to the days before COVID when we were getting along famously, who has openly talked about the fact that China ought to be welcome to invest in the United States if it wants to build EVs in the United States, who apparently seems open to doing deals on all sorts of fronts, notoriously, of course, with Putin over Ukraine, but he's repeated in his Bloomberg interview most recently, the same position on Taiwan, which is Taiwan is a very long way from us and the United States and very close to China. And Taiwan has basically been extorting the United States for protection all this time. And Trump seems quite open to the possibility of some sort of alternative arrangement. And from the point of view of American business, that's chaotic and not very well formulated as a program, and maybe contradicted by hawkish people inside Trump's own camp. But potentially that opens up the possibility for a sort of pacification of relations which, from their point of view, have become dangerously fraught. And it's not clear to me at this point where business actually comes down on this in the current moment. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that the more orderly, conventional, blob-minded version of the Biden administration is deep down. I mean, publicly, the corporates won't say this, but it's not obvious to me that they actually prefer that to the wheeler-dealer ad hocery of Trump administration.
So finally, I wanted to ask a bit more about the Republican ticket's relationship to CEOs, the leaders of this business community. this past week has seen a variety of endorsements for Trump, most notably Elon Musk, the head of Tesla, but also the CEO of and owner of Twitter, or X, one should say, formerly Twitter. But beyond that, you mentioned Jamie Dimon, who is being talked about as a potential Treasury Secretary. That's the current head of JP Morgan Chase. And yeah, just more generally, Trump had meetings with a collection of CEOs, all of whom seemed quite taken by him and have sort of let their support be known to the public. And yeah, obviously the timing of this seems coincidental with this failed assassination attempt and the shift in Trump's political fortunes. Obviously, he's sort of consolidating his advantage in the election. And I'm curious, what this reveals about the business community. I mean, is this newfound support, this declaration of support, a matter of business revealing its pre-existing ideological preferences for the Republican platform? Or is this more a matter of the business sector's political mutability? Basically, it's revealing their impulse just to kind of line up behind any likely winner in hopes of securing advantage when they're in power. I mean, how exactly, I guess, does business calculate its relationship to partisanship, its kind of political interest in these kinds of elections?
Well, I think the crucial thing here is to differentiate, again, between different business constituencies. I mean, you spoke of CEOs, and that is the language which is commonly used in the US. There's this real cult kind of worship of the chief executive officer, the CEO, the boss. And they do have certain common properties, which is that they need to be competent and vigorous. And generally speaking, they tend to be younger than presidential candidates in the US right now. And if the choice is between two people, neither of whom speaks English in a remotely coherent or grammatical fashion, but one of whom apparently is possessed by the drive to actually say something and communicate, whereas the other candidate, you sometimes wonder whether the engine has just run out and they're just stopped in mid-sentence and it's not clear whether they're going to go on. I think an energetic business person is going to prefer the Trump choice in this case, because Trump speaks to a kind of a bullion energy. He's a dynamic, thrusting figure still, despite his age, and very, very unlike Biden in his current incarnation. But, and this is the crucial but, it makes a huge difference whether you are Elon Musk or somebody running a big venture fund or hedge fund or private equity business, and you will be called CEO in all of those cases, and whether you're running a large American employer with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of employees, bound by publicity, by public ownership of your shares, by incredibly complicated codes of human resource regulation, quite possibly signed up to a bunch of ESG norms because you operate globally. These are two very, very different sociologies. They're very different class groups. And amongst the corporate leadership of the United States, the Forbes, top 100, very, very few have openly come out in favor of Trump because he's just a figure from a different reality, right? This is a man that runs clubs, that runs hotels, that runs golf courses. It's not the same as running a Bank of America or JP Morgan, where you are a highly regulated figure in the American public sphere. Jamie Dimon took a knee in 2020 because he's running a big American bank, and it was what was necessary to be done, quite apart from his personal proclivities. This is the sign of respect that was showed to the Black Lives Matter movement by going down on a knee. You can't see the titans of Silicon Valley doing anything of the sort. And why are the Silicon Valley people disposed a little bit more in Trump's direction? Well, back in 2016, it really only was Peter Thiel who went out on the limb and did that. Since then, I think the balance of opinion has shifted, in part and largely, I think, because of the position of the Biden administration. If you ultimately have to choose, you have to choose what is good for your business in the narrow sense. And the Biden administration on three domains, on crypto, on AI regulation, and on the taxation of unrealized capital gains, has made threats, seems to be headed in a direction which the Silicon Valley Titans just don't like. The Biden administration's regulators have been, in the view of the crypto-owning class, hostile to them. The Biden administration is trying to string together a version of AI regulation, and the latest budget proposal from Biden includes a 25% tax on unrealized capital gains for those with over $100 million in wealth. And that, of course, directly affects the entire venture capital business and is supposed to redistribute in an equitable way. And so it's relatively unsurprising, I think, that that particular group of people who are unconstrained by the institutional limits of big corporate governance in the United States, who are basically operating shops of 50 to 100 to maybe a couple of hundred employees, who are basically, as the Germans would say, Herr im Haus, patriarchal bosses in their own little backyard of a business, which could have a balance sheet of several hundred billion, but is nevertheless basically a light footprint organization shaped by people's personalities. Those people can shift towards Trump. It's a very different business if you're running an absolutely mainstream American firm. And Elon Musk is, of course, the liminal character, because through Tesla, he operates a really large business, a really large global business. But in terms of personality type and culture, comes out of this gunslinging, loudmouth Silicon Valley culture, which is very at odds with standard corporate governance. And there's persistent questions, therefore, also about really his focus on Tesla and his ability to go on running that company in an orderly way, which we've addressed at other points in the pod.
Yeah, that does make sense. It also does kind of disrupt the image some people might have of Silicon Valley as this sort of, part of the California liberal economic tradition. But yeah, we do have to take a break here for now. But as I mentioned, we will be back to talk about Ukraine and its potential default. Welcome back. The next data point is $24 billion. That's the amount of money that Ukraine owes to private creditors, bondholders. And yeah, the bill for those debts are about to come due. On August 1st, a 2-year suspension of Ukraine's debt payments is scheduled to expire, which is why Ukraine is now negotiating with bondholders to write down its debt. But there is no agreement by how much they should be writing it down. And in the absence of an agreement and the inability of Ukraine to pay, Ukraine could find itself in default, basically declared bankrupt. Yeah, that would obviously add a bunch of legal troubles at a time of war. So, Adam, I did want to figure out what exactly is going on here. Is Ukraine really on the verge of going bankrupt? Is that an accurate way to put it? And what would happen if it did default? How big a disaster scenario is that?
It isn't, I think, on the point of absolutely imminent default, but the money issue is a running sore in what is altogether a very difficult situation for Ukraine at this point. But perhaps we should just step back a little bit to spell out, remind ourselves of the role of money in this conflict, which goes back a long way. It's been at the heart of the Ukraine-Russia conflict at least since 2013. Fundamentally because Ukraine is one of the weakest post-Soviet economies. It started out at the level of GDP per capita quite similar to that of Poland in the late 80s, early 90s, maybe even slightly ahead of Poland, and has ended up way behind. It's always been deep in debt, foreign debt. It's been borrowing from international financial institutions and sometimes debt markets. It had an absolutely terrible crisis in 2008. The global financial crisis hit Ukraine very, very hard. And it was subsequent, rather desperate negotiations between the nominally pro-Russian government of Yanukovych and Brussels, the EU, over an improved economic relation between Ukraine and the EU to save Ukraine, that went awry in 2013 because the Europeans didn't offer enough, which tipped Yanukovych back towards Putin, who offered a lot of billions of dollars quite quickly, which precipitated the Maidan popular uprising of 2013, the EU and US-backed coup against Yanukovych, and then the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2014. Right? So when Ukrainians say that this war with Russia goes back to 2013, 2014, in other words, 10 years or more, the financial problems attendant on that also go back that far and are precipitating factors. And from a very early stage, and this is quite remarkable, the West organized through the IMF, which is notionally a neutral global institution, but in the Ukraine case, and it was really crucial, for the first time really began to take an overtly pro-Western position in the post-Cold War era. The IMF and private creditors brokered a deal to support Ukraine in its recovery from the shock of 2013-2014. Debts continue to pile up. And it's the legacy of that which we're dealing with now, and the additional loans taken on since the beginning of the war. So since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has had other more important things to worry about than its debts that go back all this time. Even in the economic sphere, far more important is the hit to the electricity system, which the Russian bombardment has delivered. They basically massively attrited all of the reserve capacity in Ukraine's system. But the money has come due because it's been on a timer, and Ukraine has piled up billions and billions of dollars in debt, both to private lenders, to the IMF, to bilateral and multilateral loans from the American government, amongst others, but also from the Europeans. And the private component of the debt was deferred in 2022 for 2 years, but only for 2 years. And furthermore, there are nasty bits of the debts that were negotiated in 2014 and 2015, which are GDP linked, and they're growth linked. So as the Ukrainian economy, it's totally perverse, recovers from the depths of the shock that it suffered from the Russian invasion in 2022, those clauses trigger, and the Ukrainian economy is declared to be thriving, and therefore Ukraine is required to make payments. And we're talking about billions of dollars of debt service. Added to which, the IMF loans are at 8% plus, which, so these are not highly concessionary loans. They're concessionary given that Ukraine is in the situation it's in, but nevertheless, they come with interest. And so Ukraine has very considerable debt service obligations running to several percentage points of GDP. It depends on how it's calculated, which is desperately trying to renegotiate. I think it's very difficult to imagine a full-on default, but it puts huge stress on Ukraine at a time when it's struggling militarily and when it is trying, in fact, to assemble an adequate package of support from the outside to enable it to continue the war into what looks like a fourth year at this point, a really grim prospect.
I'm curious then, who decides at this moment whether Ukraine then gets more financial assistance and under what conditions that assistance would be given? I mean, who are the players right now involved? And what do they all want right now?
So in debt crises around the world right now, there's this mesh of conflicting interests. And you see this whether you're looking at Zambia or Sri Lanka. The first layer is private investors who have bought Ukrainian debt, which is what we mean when we say lending. So Ukraine issues a bond, a Western fund buys it. And we're talking at the top end about BlackRock, about Amundi, which is Europe's biggest asset manager, or PIMCO, the world's leading bond fund. And they take a gamble on Ukrainian debt because it offers them a risk-return profile that you can't get if you buy US Treasury, for instance. And when things get real, as they've gotten now, they organize themselves in creditor committees. So they actually form a body, and this one's called the Ad Hoc Creditor Committee for Ukraine. And they argue with Ukraine. And if you're in this kind of business, you know that you're going to have to make concessions. And you went in underpriced, right? So you don't buy the Ukrainian debt at $100 for $100 face value. You buy it at some very large discount. And the question really is, how big is the discount that Ukraine is going to be able to extract? The Ukrainians want a 60% discount. The creditors are offering 20%. And that's, as it were, one aspect of this. The creditors are going to have to be part of the deal because the other two pieces of the puzzle are Western governments and the IMF. And the private creditors have to be part of the deal because otherwise you end up in the perverse situation in which, for instance, at the G7 meeting ahead of the NATO summit a few weeks ago, the leading Western powers agree that they're going to impound the Russian assets and use those to back a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. But what's going to happen to that loan, unless you get concessions from the private creditors, is that the loan will be used to pay the private creditors off, BlackRock and PIMCO and so on, to keep them sweet, so as to maintain Ukraine's borrowing status, its credit rating. So effectively, Western governments are being mobilized and taxpayers ultimately are on the hook for maintaining payments by way of Ukraine to BlackRock. And no one on the Western side likes that, right? So you need a private creditor deal to enable a public sector deal from the Western states. And the IMF acts as the ultimate backstop. So the IMF will lend even when private creditors are not available, at least notionally. But on the other hand, the IMF also insists on super senior creditor status. In other words, there can be no renegotiation of the principal amounts which the IMF lends. That can't happen. You can phase. So what the IMF is doing with these 8.5% interest rates is just rolling them. If the Ukrainians can't pay the interest and the repayment on a $10 billion loan, the IMF gives them a $15 billion loan, of which the majority is used to repay the first IMF loan, and then an increment remains to the Ukrainians to cover their outstanding debt. And it's this three-way relationship between the private creditors, who are ultimately going to have to absorb some of the loss, but will resist it. The governments, which are providing subsidized loans, but won't want those to be used to subsidize the private creditors. And the IMF, which will provide credit, but will not allow any write down of its loans, but will roll, if necessary, over and over again, that this is going to be played out. Pity the Ukrainians caught in this spiral. It's a nightmare from their point of view, given everything else they've got going on.
So finally, I want to ask, sort of drawing from the first part of the podcast, I'm curious how U.S. electoral politics right now affects the process of evaluating Ukraine's economic viability. I mean, obviously there is a shift towards this new populist foreign policy that we discussed, and in practice that often means not supporting Ukraine or continuing to support Ukraine in this way in the war against Russia. And I'm curious, do financial markets already kind of price that in? You know, these shifts in U.S. foreign policy, is that priced in to these financial evaluations?
So I think the first thing to say is Ukraine has got so much on its plate right now that the looming threat of a Trump presidency is not number one. You can see it in the prices of the debt. $100 worth of debt, of Ukrainian debt, can be bought from between 28 and 31 cents. So it's already at a 70% discount, which tells you huge default risk, major risk of losses on this. Of course, if you get in at 28 cents and it then rises to 31 cents, you can sell it and make a 10% profit. But right now, we're talking about massively depreciated debt that's under all sorts of different types of risk. Ukraine could lose this war. Their entire power supply could fail. That's what you're principally worrying about. Trump is the icing on the cake. What the Trump risk is doing is bringing forward the urgency of all of the financial discussions for next year. And that then compounds that incredible knot of creditor claims that we were just talking about. Because if you are going to tie down IMF and multilateral government funding for Ukraine in the next couple of months, so as to get the deals done before Trump comes in, you need the private creditors to make the concessions necessary to make those public sector deals viable now. And that's what's driven part of the urgency on the negotiations over the debt, right? So it isn't a specific risk from Trump, a specific issue one way or the other, but the general sense that uncertainty increases, including also for American political reasons going forward, that drives the pace of the negotiations. But I think it's also worth stepping back to, as it were, read an op-ed, I think that Vance did a couple of months ago, which spells out a more fundamental question here, which is, are we all basically ignoring the underlying fact, the basic arithmetic, I think is how he put it, about the issue here of Ukraine's survival and prospects going forward? The conventional position of Western governments, of NATO, of the Biden administration is, of course, that Ukraine can't fail, will not lose, and on the other hand, cannot be strong-armed into negotiations either. And the question you have to ask is this a reasonable, is this a realistic position going forward? Because is the West willing to do enough to actually put Ukraine in a position to survive, let alone win this war? And is any amount of aid that the West would actually be able to deliver going to be enough? Now, that depends on your judgment on Russia, and judgments on Russia fluctuate back and forth all the time. But the point I'm trying to get to is that we shouldn't fixate too much on the particular position of Trump and Vance and so on. We should, however, take very seriously the basic question that they're asking, which is, what is the underlying coherence of the Western position to date? How long are we actually willing to go on backing Ukraine for in a war which, in terms of the recovery of territory, it's virtually impossible to see how they can possibly win it? And if not, then what are the prospects for the stabilization of the Ukrainian state going forward if its politics and its political leadership is committed to that impossible goal? And really, isn't the fundamental issue about Ukraine's debt not the willingness of the Trump administration to mobilize new funds from Congress, but what the underlying rationale of this war effort is at all? And isn't that really the big question mark hanging over the debt? Let's not personalize this. Let's not indulge the American Democrat fixation of pointing the finger at Trump and saying source of all evil, source of all chaos. No, this is a profoundly uncertain situation, one in which the IMF normally would never have gotten involved because the risks are just simply too high to lend into a situation as unresolved as this, in which the EU and the NATO would normally never have gotten involved because, again, the risks are too high. For complicated reasons, they've both taken the step across that boundary, and now we're trying to arbitrate, debt deals in the middle of a situation which is far more profoundly uncertain than minor issues of debt pricing or of Trump advances relative positions.
Yeah, it does strike me that this is a situation where the EU has an even greater role to play than we've even, managed to discuss in this, short segment, obviously. But it's like the EU is a geoeconomic actor, and if it's as serious as it claims to be about adopting Ukraine, it seems like it'll have to face up to all these questions and have answers for them as well. So yeah, again, not something we can unpack because unfortunately we need to end here. So we will be back next week, of course, with a couple new topics. So see you then. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.